All right. Fourth, we have the question of what ought I to aim towards in life? What is Nirvana, as it's put in Sanskrit, or Nibbana, as it's put forward in Pali, the dialect that the Buddha spoke? Uh, this is a kind of a tricky one in Theravada Buddhism because of the austerity of it and the often monastic character of the way in which it's put together and organized. And it seems like you guys are anticipating a lot of that from what I see in the threads. I mean, you say, doesn't this stuff seem nihilistic, like it doesn't offer anything? And if that, what are you even supposed to do? How are you supposed to move? Well, it's a good question. This is something to deal with because I'll tell you what, Nirvana is not, it's not heaven, and it's not, there's no heaven to go to, as it were. And it's not, when we talk about it as enlightenment, really, to some extent, calling it enlightenment is more of a, that's going to be more of a Mahayana way of thinking about it. And I don't know if they would say it's wrong exactly. I don't, to be honest with you, I don't recall it being wrong in any of the Theravada texts I've seen, but it tends to be downplayed quite a bit. Instead, they'll point to a couple of things. The first thing that they'll do is they will point out that the Buddha himself always refused to discuss these things directly. That when even the word nirvana, I think I mentioned it in one of the introductory lectures on this, is it's not a positive assertion of what enlightenment's like, it's a negative assertion. When the Buddha is asked, where does the soul go upon liberation from samsara, he responds with a negative question, where does the flame go when it goes out? And from this the idea of nirvana arises. Well, the Theravada Buddhists take that insight and they say, look, there's a reason why Gautama Siddhartha didn't say any of these things. And the reason is because there's no thing to say. And nirvana is not something that you imagine and say, won't it be great, and there'll be, happiness and light and cake and dead relatives or anything like that. Nor is it something where there'll be all sorts of insight and piercing wisdom into things. Nirvana is, in some sense, an unimaginable state. If the arhat is that point on the horizon that helps you orient yourself, nirvana is that horizon, right, upon which the point stands. It is the horizon that you move towards. And in the same way that a horizon is something that you never actually achieve, it's simply something that you use to move and organize yourself to deal with your immediate situation and your immediate journey. So it is that nirvana is not something that you ask, what is it like? How do I describe it? What is its ontology? That's not useful. That is not, as the Buddhists would say, a skillful way of thinking about it, especially for the Theravada Buddhists. Rather, what they would say is that this is a way of, as with the Arhat, orienting yourself with where you are so that you begin to deal with this. Now, this brings me to the second thing. In addition to not looking directly at Theravada, not directly looking at Nirvana, one of the things that the Theravada Buddhists will also do is they'll say, even though we don't look directly at it, there is a certain sense in which we are always striving after it. And indeed, this is why you still bring it up at all. You might say, well, geez, man, I mean, if you can't even imagine what it is, if it's entirely beyond comprehension, why are we even talking about this? Why is there even Buddhism? And why does Buddhism even consider nirvana? Other than the fact that the Buddha made some quip about this 2,500 years ago to some sadhus in the forest when he was first teaching it. Why? Why is it so important? It's because of this. From the Theravada point of view, and this will also be true of the Mahayanas, but certainly from the Theravada point of view, there is a way in which the quest for nirvana is at the root of every action. What I mean by that is that as much as we are driven by this deluded craving and that this generates suffering, this craving always seeks satiety, right? Satisfaction, fulfillment. Every action, every grasping always seeks some kind of end to realize. Now the problem is, of course, as we've seen, that end can never be reached because basically it ain't there, and that's the problem. But the desire to reach that end, the desire to satiate that root of suffering at its core, that's always there. That's what the quest for nirvana is, the route to extinguish the source of suffering, the delusion of self, right? That's what it is. And insofar as we do anything, as we talk to a friend, as we try to learn more, as we scratch an itch, as we satisfy a desire or run away from something we fear, or do any of the actions that we do in each and every moment of being the human being that we are, from the Buddhist point of view, seeking nirvana. It's just that when we try to describe literally what it is beyond just the immediate situation, that's when we get into trouble. And that's the reason why the Theravada Buddhists won't look directly at it, right? They'll describe it in this conservative way, the way the Buddha himself described it. Now, this brings me to the last question. What is there for Theravada Buddhism? And again, what we have here is a very pared down view of the universe, a pared down cosmology, if you like. What you have is a situation in which all things, such as they are merely thus. They neither exist nor do not exist. But beyond that, we cannot really say anything. And indeed, language misleads us about that. There is no positive reality to deal with, to speak of. There is no such thing as a thing. And it's organizing ourselves to fundamentally be present to that, and to be present that there's no self that is a thing either, that we undo the problem of suffering. Again, if you look towards this at first, it sounds almost like the definition of nihilism. It sounds like a real downer. But what you got to realize is Theravada Buddhism doesn't organize itself to give answers. That's not what it does. And if you approach it with the idea that it'll give you an answer, you're going to be disappointed. I'm almost certain, except in very technical sorts of things. Really what it does is it tries to organize ourselves to our situation. It starts with you being you. It starts with you where you are, looking out in the situation and the way in which you, such as you are, reiterate this problem of suffering. When it talks about reality, it's not trying to assert ultimately how reality is, because after all, if there truly is nothing to assert, if there's ultimately nothing to assert, then it doesn't make sense to either assert something or not assert something. I'm going to talk about that a little bit when I talk about Nagarjuna and the four-cornered argument a little later on, different podcast. But suffice to say that it doesn't need to give these answers. It doesn't make sense, or at least it's not a concern. The only reason, and this is really a key thing I think to approaching Theravada Buddhism, the only reason to talk about any of these things, about liberation, about self, about reality, is because they are useful tools, right? They are tools that can help you act skillfully with wherever you are in your suffering to deal with the inevitability of the perishing of things. That's all they are. So when you read them, when you hear about these things, when you reflect upon these things, when you think about the ways in which these questions that I've been raising here get responded to and the way in which they work, don't look at them as for answers. Look at them as responses that are given to help you orient on a journey that you're already on and that you are always on, to undo the suffering that is present in our existence such as it is. Okay? So, all right, I'll go on to say a little bit about the other great branch of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, here in the next few podcasts. But right now I'm a little under the weather, so I think I'm going to take a break. Okay.